Chapter 6. By this time, they had reached the end of the hallway, and turning the corner, they saw another long hallway, stretching into the distance, before turning left. Blinking, Princess Eloise turned and looked behind her, only to realize that the two hallways were completely indistinguishable. "I can see how it would be easy to get turned around in here," she said, her voice quiet. "Exactly. This sort of space excels at confusing. What we really have to watch out for, though, is whoever inhabits it." His words caused Princess Eloise to draw in a sharp breath, her grip tightening on the handles of the wheelchair. "There are people here?" "Not necessarily people," Garrett replied, his voice still completely calm. "Could be monsters, spirits, aberrations, any number of things." No sooner had he finished speaking, than one of the lights up ahead flickered, as if it was going to go out, causing Princess Eloise to shriek. The sound carried down the long hallway, bouncing this way and that, until it reached the flickering light, which suddenly came back on, shining brightly. Normally, the light being off would have been creepier than the light being on, but as Princess Eloise stared at it, she realized that it was actually brighter than any of the other lights in the hall, causing her to stop walking forward. Garrett, on the other hand, regarded it with interest, quite curious about what he was seeing. The mental energy that Princess Eloise's shout contained had been infused into the light, causing it to stabilize and glow brighter than before. Turning his gaze towards one of the closer lights, Garrett sent out a spark of mental energy, and watched as it too brightened up. The change caused the princess to jump, and she quickly pulled Garrett back. "You don't have to be so cautious," Garrett said. "I don't think there's anything around us right now." "But what about those lights?" Princess Eloise asked. Glancing over his shoulder at her, Garrett saw that her face was pale, her lips set tightly together. Even terrified, she was quite pretty. Not that would help her in a space like this. "It's your voice," Garrett said. "You layer energy from your soul spark into your words. The lights absorb that energy, causing them to grow brighter. It's nothing to be afraid of, though it does lead to some potentially disquieting truths about this space." Swallowing audibly, Princess Eloise looked at the lights as Garrett explained. Typically, in a space like this, you would assume that the lights would stay on permanently. But the fact that they turn off means that they're actually burning power. That's all well and good, except that they're all currently on. This means that either they've been temporarily powered up by the person who activated this mysterious artifact, or there is something crawling around that keeps recharging them. No sooner had he spoken than there was a thump that echoed down the hall toward them. It seemed to have come from one of the rooms and caused Princess Eloise to let out a shriek. Taking a deep breath to try and control his annoyance, Garrett seriously considered just knocking her out while he tried to figure out what was going on. He had some experience with liminal spaces like this one, and he could only imagine that this wasn't the first time that the mysterious artifact had been used to trap other people. Unless they had been absorbed in their entirety, which was always a possibility, they would likely start running across whatever remained of the previous prisoners when they entered the rooms. Garrett also assumed that the mysterious artifact was controlled by someone or something, much like Isabel controlled the mirror. Ever since she had heard the thump, Eloise had begun backing up, and since she was still gripping the wheelchair tightly, Garrett was currently rolling backwards. Lifting his fist to his mouth, he coughed lightly. "Why don't we just turn around?" he suggested, trying to keep his voice bright and pleasant. "Maybe we can find something besides these long hallways." The princess loved that idea and swiftly turned the wheelchair around. She seemed to be clinging to it as if it was a shield. A few twisting turns later, she was hopelessly confused and had no idea where they had originally started. Finally, Garrett had had enough, and reaching down, forcefully engaged the brake on the wheelchair, causing it to skid to a stop. This made Princess Eloise run right into it, nearly flipping over his shoulder and into his lap. "What are you doing?" she hissed, looking around wildly. "You need to calm down," Garrett said, his voice drilling into her ears and shaking her from the ever-growing panic that had begun to consume her. She hadn't realized it, but she had been pushing the wheelchair faster and faster, and her breath was now coming in gasps. A place like this is designed to confuse you, designed to drain your energy, whether through tension or through frantic activity. The best thing you can do is simply calm down, Garrett said. The second best thing you can do is begin opening doors. After all, it's very likely that these hallways are, in fact, endless. They keep repeating, forever, eventually leading back around to the same hallways we've already been through. This is a circular maze, one that doesn't have a clear entrance or exit. Garrett knew this to be true, as he had seen them return to the same hallway already. Every time they passed a door, he would send out a little bit of mental energy to mark it. Though the environment naturally degraded these mental marks, enough of them had survived that he had been able to identify hallways they had already traversed. And when they had returned to the first one for the third time, he had pulled the brake, stopping them in place. The reality is that this space isn't that big. It just rearranges itself when it's out of sight, so it feels like it goes on forever. Instead of recovering our tracks, we should go into one of the rooms. Why do you want to open the doors? The princess asked, staring at one door as she remembered the heavy thump that they had heard. Because there might be something in there that's worth exploring, a clue as to how we can get out. These hallways clearly don't have anything new to show us, and so it's time to expand our horizons a little bit. Since Garrett was in a wheelchair, the princess took a deep breath, firmed up her courage, and stepped around him to grab the handle of one of the nearby doors. As soon as she touched it, her body shivered as if struck by an electric shock, and she released the handle. "Something the matter?" Garrett asked, his eyes narrowing. He hadn't felt any fluctuation of power, but that didn't mean that the princess hadn't experienced something. Red began to dye Princess Eloise's cheeks as she mumbled something under her breath. "I'm sorry, what was that?" Garrett asked, not sure that he had caught what she said. "I said the door handle was cold," the princess replied, perfectly aware that her behavior was quite foolish. Garrett didn't know what to say, and after a long, awkward silence, Princess Eloise grabbed the handle, this time with more force, and twisted it, flinging the door open before she had a chance to imagine what horrors lay behind. In this case, the horrors turned out to be a small bed, a washstand, and a dresser, all set in one corner of the room, and a bookshelf and reading chair set in the other. It looked like the room of a child, or at least a young teen, though Garrett had trouble figuring out why he felt that way. It wasn't until his eyes caught sight of the painting, hanging over the bed, that he realized what had given him that impression. The picture showed a boy of about 12, 1 foot raised on a stair in front of a large, palatial home. A dog lounged at his feet, and he held a bow in one hand, and an arrow in the other. His gaze was bright and direct, and the expression on his face pleasant. Seeing that there was nothing to be afraid of, Princess Eloise led the way into the room, and Garrett followed after her. The first thing he examined was the bookshelf. None of the books were labeled, and when he opened one of the leather-bound tomes, the pages were filled with gibberish. Frowning, he closed the book and put it back, his eyes sweeping the room once again, pausing ever so slightly on the portrait of the frowning boy. He hadn't noticed the storm clouds gathered on the horizon that cast a long shadow over the house, or the deep shadows extending from the boy and his dog. Princess Eloise had been looking at the chest of drawers, which were all empty. She found herself quite relieved that this was the case, and took a deep breath as she sat on the bed. "I admit, this isn't what I believed we would find when we opened the door," she said. "I had geared myself up for a fight, but this seems completely normal." "Well, not completely. Don't get too relaxed," Garrett said calmly. "We are in for a fight." No sooner had he finished speaking than there was another bang, this time the sound of a door slamming, causing Eloise's eyes to grow as wide as saucers. She stood up, her hand going to a hidden slit in her skirt. Watching her pull a dagger out, Garrett found himself amused. According to what he knew, the princess had never fought once while in the palace, and in the 6 months that had passed since then, he sincerely doubted that she had learned how to use the dagger she was now holding. Garrett, on the other hand, was always ready for a fight, and with a twitch of his finger, he cast Illusory Dream, adjusting what the princess could see. To her, it appeared that he looked nervously at the door, clenching his wheelchair tightly with his one hand. In reality, Garrett had tapped his finger on his armrest, and dozens of rainbow flowers sprouted underneath him, beginning their slow crawl out into the room to take up their positions. Though Garrett much preferred to have other people do his fighting for him, he recognized that wasn't an option this time, and so he thought it best to act preemptively. Closing his eyes, he cast Observe the Dream, sending his perception out into the hallway to observe what was coming in their direction. At first he didn't see anything, but then, a shift in the light caught his attention, and he realized what he was looking at. Practically invisible, there was an amorphous shadow seeping across the wall and floor like ink. Whether the shadow was the actual creature, or whether the creature was invisible, but still casting a shadow, Garrett had no idea. All he knew is that as the thing got closer, it seemed to grow more and more defined. The shadow on the wall grew darker and darker, until it solidified, emerging as a taloned monstrosity, with dozens of appendages that flailed in the air as it crept silently toward the door. Hundreds of eyes that transformed into mouths and then back into eyes covered its body, teeth gnashing silently as it crept towards the room they were in. At first, Garrett was a bit concerned, as the shadow swelled until it filled the entire hallway, completely drowning out the light as it passed by various lamps. But the closer it got, the weaker it seemed, and he quickly realized that it was simply ballooning itself up to make it appear bigger and scarier than it would otherwise be. The door they had entered through was still hanging open. As Princess Eloise moved to shut it, the monster suddenly surged around the corner and over the threshold, its limbs flailing wildly. Princess Eloise let out a scream and stabbed with her dagger, managing to score a hit on one of the creature's arms. This caused it to open its eyes and mouth in a silent roar. Furious with the attack, the creature lunged forward. However, a bright glow suddenly surrounded Princess Eloise's pendant she was wearing flashed. The glow burned away the monster's shadow body, tearing it to shreds and dispersing it into the air. Immediately, the lights in the room grew brighter as they absorbed the ambient mental energy being released. The shadow shook violently and withdrew for a moment, causing the barrier around the princess to fade from sight. The monster was clearly lacking intelligence because as soon as the barrier disappeared, it launched itself forward once more, attempting to swallow Princess Eloise a second time. However, the barrier popped back up, burning it again. This repeated 3 or 4 times while Garrett watched the princess flailing about with her dagger with a bemused expression. She was awakened, of that he was sure, as he had felt the power her words contained. But clearly, nobody had actually taught her how to use her powers, and so her dagger strikes were doing practically nothing to the shadow creature. This wasn't the first time Garrett had run across a creature of this nature, though the last had been significantly more powerful. This led Garrett to wonder if this monster was of a lower rank, or if it was just starved for mental energy. One of the things he could clearly see was that the lights continually absorbed the monster's mental energy, but the opposite was not true. To Garrett, the lights that burned brightly in the room should have been a source of mental energy. In fact, he had already set a few of his dream flowers to begin siphoning mental energy from them. It only took him a moment, however, to realize what was going on. The light released by the lamps was antithetical to the very nature of the shadow monster, causing it to burn every time it encountered the very bright light. As soon as that thought occurred, Garrett began to understand the place where they were trapped. In front of him, Princess Eloise was still trying to fight. After watching her for another minute, Garrett began to speak quietly, his words carried with a thread of mental energy directly into her ears. The power in your soul spark isn't just for using abilities, you can actually manipulate it directly. In the lighting stage, your goal is to gather as much energy as possible, lighting your spark and then packing it full as you start to shape it. By focusing it on the dagger in your hand, you should have more luck fighting against this shadow. Chapter 7. The princess was clearly terrified, but to her credit, she had stepped in front of Garrett to try and fight the monster, no doubt assuming that Garrett wouldn't be capable of such a thing. The amulet she wore was a powerful defensive artifact, but she could tell that the glow it produced that kept the shadow monster at bay was starting to dim ever so slightly. At this point, it seemed to be a race against the clock to see which of them would be able to endure longer than the other, and unfortunately, The shadow was looking like it was going to win. More and more darkness seemed to stream into the room, allowing the monster to reform its body every time it began to burn. It hated the pain, but some strange survival instinct drove it forward time and again, as it tried to wear away the shield that surrounded the princess. Eloise was beginning to panic. She felt like she was drowning when she heard Garrett's words, and gripped onto them like they were a life-saving rope, tossed into the water next to her. Her soul spark flared, sending a rush of energy flowing through her, but Garrett's words continued to ring in her head, helping her concentrate the energy so as not to waste it. She could feel it flowing through her arm and into the dagger, and with a shimmer, the dagger took on the same quality as the shield that surrounded her, glowing brightly as she slashed at one of the shadow creature's many limbs. Previously, her attacks did nothing to harm the main body of the shadow monster, but now, imbued with mental energy, her dagger tore through the monster's arm, causing a great clump of shadow to be separated from the main body and disperse into the air. The monster let out a silent shriek, trying to express the tremendous pain it felt, and Princess Eloise, though still terrified, sensed the opportunity for victory. Under Garrett's astonished gaze, she suddenly rushed forward, pressing directly into the shadow monster, as she hacked and slashed with all of her might. Up until this point, she had been fighting completely defensively, and her sudden assault caught the monster off guard. Between the bright burning shield that covered her body from head to toe, and the glowing dagger that tore into the deep shadows that made up the monster's flesh, the princess quickly burned a hole straight through it, causing it to shrink considerably when it reformed. Frightened by the explosive power the princess had just shown, the monster turned its attention to the interior of the room, and saw Garrett, who looked at it with a calm gaze. The shadow monster had been completely fixated on the princess, and hadn't noticed Garrett up until now. For the briefest of moments, its hazy mind considered leaping into the room to try to consume Garrett before it continued to fight the princess, who had just stumbled straight through its body into the hall. Then its survival instincts kicked in, and it shook terribly, as it realized that moving even a few inches into the room would spell its complete and utter doom. Instead, it tried to flee down the hall, but before it could, the princess's dagger stabbed through its body again, burning up what remained of it. A moment later, the princess staggered back into the room where Garrett sat, her breath coming in great heaves as she stared first at Garrett, and then down at the dagger she held in her hand. Her expression was incredulous, as if unable to believe that she had actually managed to defeat the monster. In contrast, Garrett's was calm. "Well done, princess," he said, a ghost of a smile on his lips. "That was incredibly impressive. If I'm honest, I didn't actually expect you to defeat such a powerful enemy." Still trying to get her breathing under control, all the princess could do was nod. "Why don't you come and have a seat?" Garrett said. "As I mentioned previously, a large part of my power is communication, and I'm currently communicating with people on the outside who are working to understand this mysterious artifact. Our rescue should come quickly. But until then, we'll need to preserve as much energy as we can, just in case there are more of those monsters lurking nearby." Nodding, Princess Eloise retreated to the bed, first sitting on it, and then flopping backwards to try and rest. In her mind, Garrett wasn't suited for fighting at all, which meant that if there were in fact more shadow monsters, she would be the one who had to deal with them. Outside of the Dreamer'S Inn, a carriage had pulled up, and from it, Chief Felix emerged, followed a moment later by Marta and Ren. They hurried into the great room, where they found a bunch of the family members sitting around. Seeing them, Ob stood up from his chair and waved for them to follow, taking them back to Garrett's office, where the mysterious artifact was sitting in the middle of his desk. As soon as he saw it, Chief Felix inhaled sharply. His eyes glowed with a faint white light as he stepped around the desk and crouched to examine it more closely. After looking at it from a couple of different angles, he carefully picked it up and traced his fingers along the silver grooves and patterns that covered the 4 different sides. The last thing he looked at was the spike. Only a short while ago, it had been covered in blood, but now it was as clean as could be, shining brightly in the sunlight that filtered through the office window. The others watched him quietly, and when Chief Felix put it down, Ren asked the question that was on everybody's mind. Do you know what this is? And more importantly, do you know how to get Garrett out of it? I do, Chief Felix said, scratching his grizzled chin. At least I know what it is. As for how to get him out, that's going to be a little bit harder. Her eyes narrowing, Rin stared at the chief exorcist. So what is it? This is called Kobold's Maze, Chief Felix said, picking the box up and looking over it as he spoke. It's actually an exorcist tool, one designed to trap supernatural creatures, particularly supernatural creatures made from the shadow. Noticing the frown on Rin's face, Chief Felix hurried to clarify, that doesn't mean it can't capture others. In fact, it's often been used to capture very dangerous individuals. But the main purpose was to trap supernatural creatures whose powers and abilities were made from a shadow, and to slowly drain them of their power until they perished. There were a few of these made, but I didn't know that any of them still existed. After all, use of Kobold's Maze has been outlawed for 100 years, and all of them were supposed to have been destroyed. The principle is simple. The maze can only open when blood is fed to it, usually via the spike here. When that happens, the maze will open, and the person who contributed the blood can set a target. The maze will suck that individual in, trapping them inside. And how do you get them back out? Rin asked. Chief Felix could only offer her a wry smile. It's not made to let people out, Marta said, her face covered in a frown. The goal is to permanently trap whoever is brought inside. That's not an acceptable answer, Rin said, her voice hard. We need a way to release them, or the consequences will be catastrophic. We'll have to do some more research, Chief Felix said, to see if it's ever happened before. As he spoke, he glanced at Marta, who had an odd look in her eye as she stared at the artifact. There is another option, she said. Oh, and what's that? Well, we could force it to outbreak. Outbreak? What's an outbreak? Rin asked, noting the worried expression that covered Chief Felix's face. How would that help? When a mysterious artifact grows too powerful, it can sometimes outbreak, merging with the world and creating a space that it controls completely. Its influence will begin to extend beyond the artifact itself into its surroundings, transforming everything around it. Outbreaks are incredibly dangerous, so dangerous that stopping them is the chief goal of the exorcists. Would it work? Rin asked. Chief Felix immediately shook his head. No, and we're not trying it. As he spoke, he shot a glare at Marta, who had been about to protest, causing her to reluctantly close her mouth. After promising to do more research about it, Chief Felix left, but not after a lively debate over who should hold the artifact. The chief wanted to take it with him, but Rin was adamantly opposed, refusing to let it out of her sight. Once the two exorcists had left the inn, Rin sat down in the office with the box in her hands, examining it carefully. The more she looked at it, the more mesmerizing the patterns seemed to be, and what she found strange was that they also grew more familiar, as if this wasn't her first time seeing them. She couldn't place them, however, and with a sigh, she closed her eyes and began to communicate with Garrett, explaining everything that they had discovered. Princess Eloise had just laid down when Garrett got the message, and after listening to Rin's explanation, he put his mind to work to unravel the secrets of how to enter and exit this world. With Princess Eloise resting, the first thing Garrett did was create a copy of himself, to remain in position, while he stood to his feet and walked out of the room. With each step he took, his body changed, transforming into Geller's appearance, a white mask covering his face, and his clothing replaced by Geller's three-piece suit. Out in the hall, he began to look around, until his eyes landed on one of the paintings. Unlike the painting in the room, the paintings in the hallway were shadowy and indistinct, leaving the viewer with the impression that they had seen something wonderful, but no actual memory of what it was. Furthermore, whenever he focused on a painting, it was clear that it was nothing but shifting hues of black and gray. An idea slowly began to shape as he looked at the lights high up on the walls. Each of the paintings was positioned so that it was in between the lights, falling into the darkest part of the hallway, spaced perfectly so that none of them were touched by the pools of bright light. As he thought about it, the same was true for the painting in the room. It was at the place furthest from the lamp that sat next to the reading chair. Casting his mind back into the room, Garrett found himself amused when he realized that the expression of the child in the painting had grown frightened. Whether the child was frightened of Princess Eloise, who was laying on the bed underneath him, or the dozens of dream flowers that had crowded around his frame hungrily, Garrett didn't know or care. It was clear to him that the shadow monster had inhabited these paintings, hiding the majority of its body inside of the frames, out of the bright light that would constantly absorb its energy. Interested in testing it out, Garrett sent a thread of mental energy to the nearest lamp, allowing it to flash with bright light. The reaction was immediate as the light grew, falling over the frame and into the painting. Immediately, the swirling dark hues that covered the painting retreated, pulling back out of the light to reveal green grass and what appeared to be a garden scene. Immediately, the monster knew that the jig was up, and with a soundless shriek, it flooded out of the painting to fill the hallway. Garrett smiled mercilessly under his mask, his hand extending as his soul spark thrummed with power, unleashing a crushing blast that smashed the growing shadow back. Snapping his fingers in the air, Garrett transformed the streams of power spreading from his soul spark into dozens of petals, each glimmering with a rainbow sheen. Darting through the air like a school of fish, the petals stabbed deep into the shadow, burning it away, even as Garrett's mental power continued to crush it to the ground. Next came the dream flowers, marching out of the room on wiggling roots, their petals vibrating hungrily as they headed for the shadow. For its own part, the shadow fought as fiercely as it could, but every time it tried to make a blade or hook from one of its many tendrils, the petals were there to slice it apart. A few times it tried to escape, but Garrett's power locked it in place. Within a few minutes, the last dregs of shadow had been consumed, and Garrett turned his attention to the picture that had been revealed. In it, he saw a man and a woman strolling in a garden on a blustery spring day. In the woman's hand was a bright red parasol that contrasted sharply with the green of the plants and the cloud-spotted blue of the sky. After appreciating it for a moment, Garrett walked down the hall, until he arrived at the next painting. The black and gray shadow that covered it undulated more than normal, as if it had been able to sense the demise of its companion. After regarding it for a moment, Garrett glanced down the hallway, noting how many paintings there were, and how many shadows he would have to destroy. If he did them each one by one, it would likely take him days. And so instead, he gave a command, and the dream flowers began to spread out. Each dream flower climbed the wall and attached itself to one of the lights. Instead of sucking the power out of it, however, Garrett used it as a conduit to allow him to begin injecting power in. Immediately, the hallway brightened, and then brightened again. Soon, the lights were burning so brightly that the pools of light they cast had spread almost twice as far. Already, the paintings were beginning to shake as the shadow monsters they hid began to grow afraid. With a grim smile, he sent another surge of energy through each of the dream flowers and into the lights, drowning the hallway in a bright glow that gave the shadows no place to hide. The light was so bright that he had to squint despite the fact that he was wearing a mask, and the entire space seemed to shake as waves of shadow burst from the paintings. Already, they were beginning to corrode, their bodies transforming into wisps of energy that only reinforced the bright burning lights. Chapter 8. A few of the shadows encountered one another, but to Garrett's surprise, instead of merging together, they began to rip and tear, each trying to consume the other. This just caused them to fall apart even faster, and after only a few minutes, the last of the shadows burned away, leaving the hallway bright and clean. The success of this method encouraged Garrett, and with a thought, he sent the dream flowers into the next hallway. Had the shadow monsters possessed any real intelligence, they would have banded together to try and stop him. But as it was, their instinctive fear kept them in hiding until it was too late. Occasionally, Garrett would take control of his illusion that was still back in the room, talking to Princess Eloise to reassure her, even as he continued to clear the hallways one by one. It took almost 6 hours before he was finished, mainly because he had begun opening the doors in the hallway as well, cleaning out the rooms of the shadows that lurked inside of them. In a couple of rooms, he found brittle bones that collapsed into dust as soon as he touched them. There were even a few items that looked like artifacts, but they had been sucked clean of energy as well, and followed the fate of the bones. After those 6 long hours, Garrett, who was beginning to feel quite exhausted, returned to the room where the princess and his illusion were. By this time, the princess was sitting on the bed. Her knees were pulled up under her chin, and her arms were wrapped around her legs as she talked about her many experiences since she had fled the city 6 months ago. Though he had heard everything that she had said to his illusion, Garrett paused outside the door, his forehead furrowing as he listened to her quiet voice. The enchanting quality her soul spark gave her was absent as she spoke, pouring out heartfelt words about how hard it had been. And as he listened, Garrett found his heart softening. The truth was, he would have been happy if Princess Eloise had never appeared in front of him. He had too many things to worry about as he tried to help the Klein family navigate the dangers contained in both the dream and the waking world. He had been happy to support the princess's claim to the throne from afar, but then she had shown up, pulling him into yet another mess that would threaten both his safety and the safety of those he was responsible for. So far, in Garrett's head, the princess was little more than an annoyance, and had the opportunity come to dump her in the river with no one the wiser, Garrett may have taken it. His every conversation with her had been one filled with verbal sparring, as she tried to get his undying support, and he tried to avoid making any commitments. Now, however, that seemed to be the furthest thing from her mind. They were trapped in this shadowy world, a world with no exit. And though Garrett kept assuring her that the people outside were working on it, Princess Eloise clearly didn't believe him. As a way to fight her fears, she had begun to tell him about her escape, and after, about her life in Port Reverie. It had clearly been difficult, as she had been surrounded by people on all sides, each interested in using her to further their own aims, not caring that she had just passed through an incredibly traumatic experience. In order to ensure her survival, the princess had no choice but to play along, hardening her heart and binding tight the still bleeding wounds that covered it. That hadn't caused them to stop bleeding, however. And now, as words gushed out of her, tears did as well. Not the sobbing cry of someone looking for sympathy, but tears born from genuine pain. It was a strange thing for Garrett to suddenly realize that the princess was only a scared young woman. Of course he had known that, and what actually caught him off guard was the realization that he had completely overlooked it as he engaged with her. Taking off his mask, Garrett ruefully rubbed his chin, ashamed to admit that he gave her as much consideration as he gave one of the monsters that inhabited the dream, and it wasn't just her, but rather seemed to be everyone who didn't bear one of the dream flowers. Garrett had known that he had grown cold since awakening in this world, but it was only now that he was realizing the extent of it, and it carried frightening connotations. He already thought of himself as more monster than human. After all, the dream flowers that spread throughout the sleeping world were born of his mind, but now, Garrett was beginning to wonder what that would mean for his future. Deep sympathy began to creep into Garrett's heart, and for a moment he considered entering the room to comfort the crying princess, but just as he started to take a step forward he felt his soul spark thrum and the cloudy look that had shrouded his eyes cleared up. A terrible coldness filled Garrett, and for a long moment he remained absolutely still, his foot poised to move. After the moment passed, he put his foot back down and looked down at his hands, trying to figure out where these strange fluctuations of emotion were coming from. It was true that he had already stepped into a realm that normal humans had no way to touch, but his coldness wasn't born of that. It had been with him from the beginning. It was true that the princess' arrival had introduced a complication into his plans, but that would have never caused his emotions to fluctuate before. Something is wrong with me. The knowledge hit Garrett like a heavy slap and sent his mind whirring as scenes flashed past his eyes. Something had changed in the last week, something that made him more susceptible to changes in emotion, especially anger and annoyance. Taking a deep breath, Garrett calmed his heart, working to untangle his thoughts from the feelings that surged through him. It wasn't that Garrett was or had any desire to be emotionless, but rather, he wanted to keep his thinking clear and unencumbered by the waves of feeling that had been battering him recently. Inside the room, Princess Eloise came to the end of her tale and slowly fell silent. Taking one final deep breath and replacing his mask on his face, Garrett took that as his cue to enter and stepped into the doorway, greeting his own illusion with a nod. Princess Eloise was staring at him, her eyes wide, so he executed a bow. "Greetings, Princess. I am one of the Klein family's associates. You may call me Geller. I've come to get you out of this place." He could see hope blooming in the princess's eyes, and so he stepped forward and offered a hand to help her off the bed. Once she was standing next to him, he gestured to the painting of the young boy on the wall above the bed. "It turns out that the exit has been closed to us this entire time," he said, directing the princess's attention to the frightened-looking boy. This was the first time she had realized there was a change in the picture's expression, and as she gasped, Garrett took a small step backward. Since her attention was elsewhere, it was simple for him to exchange positions with his illusion, taking his seat in the wheelchair and reforming his masked figure. He controlled his illusion to point at the picture, causing the face of the young boy to grow panicked as it stared pleadingly at him. It wasn't hard for Garrett to communicate his desires to the painting, and after a few moments of silence, the boy suddenly nodded, his eyes flashing with relief. A shapeless force surrounded the three of them, and a moment later, Garrett and the princess found themselves standing in front of Rin, who held Kobold's maze in her hand. "You're back!" Rin yelled, rushing forward to hug Garrett. At the last moment, he caught her hand, which was still holding the mysterious artifact, preventing the spike it bore from stabbing into his shoulder. With a silly laugh, she dropped it into his lap and put both arms around him, hugging him tightly. The princess, who was quite disoriented from the sudden shift of surroundings, looked around, blinking for a moment before she recognized the office. "Yes, we're back," Garrett said, his voice muffled as Rin nearly strangled him. "Thank you for your help." After a long minute, Rin let him go and Garrett reached down to pick up the mysterious artifact, staring at it with curiosity. According to the information the exorcist had brought over, this mysterious artifact shouldn't have existed anymore, and he found himself quite curious as to where Jero and the Ebony Alliance had gotten their hands on it. The thought of the rival gang caused Garrett to frown slightly, which in turn caused Rin to ask if there was anything wrong. "Nothing we need to worry about right now," Garrett replied. "Please send word to the other seats that I'm back. They can come and visit if they're interested in confirming it. Also, let the exorcist know that I've managed to find my way out of the maze." Princess Eloise had been waiting quietly next to Garrett, and after Rin dashed out of the room, she took a deep breath and bowed her head towards Garrett. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" Garrett asked, his eyebrows rising. "You're the one who saved us from that shadow monster, but it was your associate who helped us escape from that strange place," the princess countered. "And thank you for listening to me. For a person in my position, it's hard to find someone willing to listen." Garrett almost retorted that he hadn't had a choice, but decided better of it, and instead just smiled and nodded. "It's my pleasure, Princess. I'm perfectly willing to lend you an ear whenever you need it." By this time, Morris had learned that the princess was back, and just as Garrett finished talking, he burst into the room before rushing over, looking almost as if he was going to hug her. At the last minute, he got a hold of himself, and instead knelt swiftly. "Your Highness, I'm glad you're safe. I have failed in my duty. Please punish me. There's little anyone can do against mysterious artifacts. And besides, Garrett ensured my safety," the princess said, giving Garrett all of the credit. The look Morris gave Garrett was complicated, as if he was both thankful and frustrated that Garrett had been the one to save the princess. Princess Eloise was exhausted, and soon retired to her room, leaving Garrett to carefully consider everything that had happened. His eyes kept returning to the mysterious artifact, partly because of what he could sense going on inside of it. Closing his eyes, he reached out a finger to touch the silver spike, channeling his mental energy into it, as he formed a connection with the dream flowers who had remained inside. Using a wisp of mental energy, he reformed his body as an illusion, appearing once more in front of the painting of the little boy. "Come out," he said, beckoning with his finger. Almost immediately, the young boy sprang out of the image, causing the dog to bark soundlessly. Quite curious, the boy looked around, and it wasn't long before a few other images began to appear in the painting he had just left, including the woman with the red parasol who had been walking in the garden. They came in from the edges of the image, almost as if they were real people, crowding together and peering out at Garrett. The young boy floated in the air in front of him, his eyes bright, as he quickly bowed over and over again. "Stop that," Garrett said. His gaze narrowed as he stared at the young boy, who immediately froze, mid-bow. "Straightened up and explain what's going on." Lifting his head, the boy hesitated for just a moment before speaking, his voice crisp. "I am the warden," he said, "guard of this prison." Hearing the boy describe the mysterious artifacts as a prison, Garrett's expression eased. "You said you're the warden, so you're in charge of guarding the prisoners who have entered?" "Yes," the boy said, bowing again, before catching himself. "And I have to thank you for your timely assistance. If not for you, the prison would have eventually failed, allowing the shadows to escape into the outside world, but thanks to you, that threat has been eliminated." Glancing at all of the people in the picture above the bed, Garrett gestured to the hall outside of the room. "And what of them? Are each of the paintings a spirit, like you?" Immediately, every single one of the people in the image shook their head, all perfectly matched with the young boy. "We're all one," he said, "the same spirit. We are the warden." Even as the young boy spoke, all of the figures in the image, including the dog, mouthed the words. It was quite a creepy scene, but Garrett took a deep breath and stabilized the disquiet in his heart. Despite having encountered all sorts of terrifying things, he found he still wasn't immune when he saw something new. "When I came in here," Garrett said, "it seemed that the shadows were the ones in charge, rather than you." A chagrined expression flashed across the warden's face, and he nodded unhappily. "Yes, while the prison is powerful, it takes us time to deal with the prisoners, and we require energy from outside in order to brighten the lights. For a long time, ever since I remember, energy was provided. But then one day, it ceased, and slowly the lights burned through their fuel, casting much of the hall into darkness. Little by little, the shadows realized that they could take refuge in the paintings, protecting themselves from what remained of the light. More than one of my selves was devoured by the shadows as the halls fell into darkness. Only a few of the rooms, including this one, had been able to remain free from the shadows. Now that the shadows are gone, what will you do next?" Garrett asked, and was amused when the warden's eyes lit up. "We'll wait for more prisoners," he said. "Thanks to these flowers that you brought, we should have plenty of energy, and so long as they continue to provide us energy, we can return to our original goal." Garrett continued to press the warden with questions, mostly interested if the spirit understood how the liminal space had been created in the first place. When it quickly became apparent that the warden had no awareness of anything outside of the prison or his specific roles, Garrett sent him back to the painting and then left. As he idly turned the box over in his hand, he mused that this world was full of secrets and mysteries. While many mysterious artifacts appeared to have been created when the dream world bled over into reality, this device was no accident. Kabod's maze had clearly been engineered for a purpose, which meant that someone, somewhere, at some time, had known how to create mysterious artifacts. The design was rather gruesome, as it required the blood of the wielder in order to activate. It was the same blood that fed the artifact, providing energy for it, though Garrett had figured out a way to bypass that with his dream flowers. He wasn't quite sure what he was going to do with it, and so for the moment, he simply put it aside, leaving it on his desk. It looked rather out of place, however, and so after a moment, he picked up one of the receipts that had been placed on his desk and stuck it down on the spike, covering the ornate box underneath. Happy with that, he began to slowly make his way out of the office, heading for the large dining room where he hoped to get some food. The rest of the evening passed uneventfully at the inn, though from what Garrett gathered through the Dream Flower network, the rest of the city was not nearly so quiet. The other gangs were in an uproar, unable to believe that Garrett had simply reappeared in the inn. A few members of the Ebony Alliance even snuck into the Klein family's territory to try and see if they could catch sight of Garrett. Chapter 9. Garrett had noticed them before anybody else did, and gave careful instruction to let them get close enough to glimpse him through the inn's windows. Watching them hurry off into the night to report their findings to Jero, Garrett's expression was cold. He didn't want conflict, and would have been more than happy to negotiate with the Ebony Alliance, even allowing them to continue to move their goods through his territory for free. But Jero had schemed against him, and in Garrett's mind, that put her firmly in the camp of the enemy, which meant there was only one thing to do, and that was eliminate her, and her gang, down to the very root. Even before he had gotten out of the maze, he had been considering how to approach this situation. Much like the Hunters gang that served under the Adventurers Guild, Ebony Alliance was primarily made up of adventurers, awakened who risked their lives in the swamps to the east of the city. It was terribly dangerous territory, filled with poisonous insects and plants and dangerous beasts, always looking for their next meal. The result was that the gang's official members were battle-hardened and dangerous, a force to be reckoned with. Jero herself was a powerful warrior, and had only been outmatched by Sinon because the Grave Walker Guild leader had acquired the other half of Lasric's flame. As far as Garrett saw it, there were two options. The first, and by far the simplest, was to simply eliminate the Ebony Alliance completely. Garrett was confident that this could be done, though it would be a hard fight, and the potential for things going wrong was high. On top of that, to truly eliminate the gang, he would be forced to reveal a number of his secret forces. The other option, of course, was to begin taking them over slowly, extending the network of dream flowers into their territory, and infecting the awakened one by one. This was a much slower avenue, but one that would yield tremendous results if he could actually carry it out. The problem, of course, was Jero herself, as she was simply too strong for Garrett to plant a dream seed in her. After becoming a shaper, Garrett had found it fairly simple in lighting level awakened, but the condensed energy contained in a shaper stage soul spark was simply too much for the dream flower seeds to survive. Deciding to think on it a little bit more, Garrett returned to his bedroom to lie on his bed, and a moment after he closed his eyes, he was sitting on the Dreamer's throne. Reveling in the warmth of the energy the throne exuded, Garrett let his mind drift. Many pinpricks of light surrounded him, each one representing one of the flowers planted around the inn. His overlord flower, Somnia, had taken over sorting the information and had done a tremendous job, allowing him to digest everything that had happened in the last 24 hours. Once he had caught up on everything going on with the Klein family, Garrett stood up from the throne and left his room, appearing in Dreamer's Rest, the strange inn that existed in his mental space. It was just as bustling as usual, and it had actually expanded once more. It was almost impossible for Garrett to wrap his mind around how the inn actually worked, as there were currently close to 6,000 people present in it. The inn appeared to be a massive room, yet at the same time, it was clearly divided into a number of smaller spaces. These rooms mixed together to join and separate as needed, and the only thing that was consistent was the bar in the middle. The overwhelming majority of people in Dreamer's Rest were mortals, unawakened who had found their way to the inn through their dreams. They used it as a place to communicate with each other, to talk about their lives, to share struggles, and develop solutions. There was a section where merchants could cut deals, another where a group of local blacksmiths had gathered to talk about techniques over their pines, and still others where different groups gathered together to engage with others who shared like interests. The awakened who did come to the bar would all eventually filter into the VIP section above the stairs. Garrett had arranged it so that only the awakened could see the stairs, leaving the mortals below completely unaware that there was another part to the bar. Here, the awakened would be able to take missions, venturing out from the bar to the city outside. Garrett had just begun to walk up the steps when he sensed an unfamiliar presence. Immediately, his gaze sharpened, but he didn't stop working and soon arrived at the top of the wide staircase. There was a large circular table that always had enough seats for however many awakened had shown up that night, and he saw Pax, Kinsley, Marin, Estelle, and Asher all sitting together, chatting quietly. When Pax saw him, she leapt up and walked over. "You said you wanted to see us?" she asked, her voice full of life. Seeing her reminded Garrett of Viper, causing his heart to twinge. "Yes," he said softly. "I'd like to issue you a special mission. I'd like you to head south until you find the water, and I'd like you to try and figure out how to cross it." Considering his request for a moment, Pax nodded. "All right," she said, "we'll report what we find." As she went to gather the rest of her team, Garrett turned his attention to a figure sitting in the corner. There were a few tables set along the side of the VIP section, arranged there for people who wanted to have private conversations. A robed figure sat at one of the tables, an untouched drink in front of him. Unlike most of the awakened who entered this space, however, Garrett could tell that the robed figure had no soul spark. Yet even without it, the energy that surrounded them was thick and heavy, causing a suspicion to flash through Garrett's mind. Strolling over to the table, he was unsurprised to see the figure rise and bow. "Greetings, Great Ruler." Before the figure could continue, Garrett held up his hand, forestalling whatever else they had intended to say. "This is not the place for that conversation," Garrett said. "Follow me." Walking past the table, he headed straight for the wall, which had suddenly transformed into an archway. There was a simple room beyond it, with a dais, and an ornate-looking chair. Without waiting to see if the robed figure would follow, Garrett entered the room and sat down, watching as the robed figure walked hesitantly in after him. With a wave of Garrett's hand, the wide doorway transformed back into a wall, sealing them in together. "Forgive me," Garrett said, in a voice that made it clear he didn't actually care if he was forgiven or not, "but I don't like unannounced visitors." Completely understandable. As he spoke, the figure took down his hood, revealing a pale face. It was the face of a man, with strange black marks on his cheekbones, chin, and forehead. Two crimson eyes stared out at Garrett, unblinking, and when the man spoke, his lips and chin barely moved, almost as if his face was actually a mask. "My most sincere apologies for coming uninvited, but considering your relatively new ascension to your position, I simply couldn't find anyone who could introduce us." Executing a sweeping bow, the robed man continued, "My name is Karn, purveyor of eclectic goods. I travel the realms, exchanging oddities and collecting tidbits." "You're a traveling merchant?" Garrett asked, resting his cheek in his palm as he lounged in his ornate chair. "You might call me that," Karn responded, straightening up. "Others might call me a tinker, as I have a wide variety of skills. Mostly, however, I share about the world outside your realm. After all, as a great ruler, it can be particularly hard to find time to travel." The longer Garrett looked at Karn, the more curious he found him to be. It was clear that Karn wasn't human, but he wasn't quite a spirit either, meaning that he was likely some sort of third race, something that Garrett had never encountered before. Even as Garrett stared at Karn was staring back, naked curiosity in his eyes. Seeing that Garrett wasn't saying anything, Karn continued, "First, congratulations on your ascent. It is exceedingly rare to find humans in the dream, especially ones who have ascended to a realm. Your achievement is worthy of praise." "Thank you," Garrett said, his voice calm. "In light of your tremendous achievement, allow me to offer you a gift." Karn slowly reached into his cloak, his eyes fixed on Garrett, as if expecting Garrett to stop him, but Garrett didn't move, continuing to lounge in his chair as he watched Karn, seemingly without a care in the world. As slowly as he had put his hand into his cloak, Karn drew it out, holding a rolled-up scroll, nearly 3 feet long. "May I approach?" Looking every part the ruler, Garrett raised his hand with languid grace and gestured for him to come forward. From the cautious way that Karn walked forward, it was clear that he had dealt with some unpredictable rulers before. And after placing the scroll down on the dais, he quickly retreated to what he considered a safe distance. Garrett twitched the finger and the scroll flew through the air to land in his hands. He carefully examined the scroll, but it didn't seem to be dangerous. And so he sat up and unrolled it, revealing a detailed map of the city, labeled with half a dozen locations marked in red. When he saw that his inn was one of them, Garrett's eyes narrowed and he looked up at Karn. "Is this a map of the city?" "It is, Your Majesty. This map marks each of the territories of the active great rulers. If you focus on one of the territories, you'll see its area of influence, including any other territories that are connected." Sure enough, when Garrett examined the location of the inn on the map, a faint light shone around the parts of the city under his control, and the first tomb appeared underneath the royal graveyard. A glance across the map showed Garrett that there were 5 other active rulers. But rather than examine them now, He rolled up the scroll and held it in his hands, nodding to Karn. "My thanks," he said. "This is quite a valuable gift." "It is my pleasure, Your Majesty." Much more interested in what Karn might have to offer after seeing the map, Garrett leaned forward on his chair. "Tell me, you said you deal in oddities and tidbits. What is it that you trade for those things?" "Other oddities and tidbits, of course," Karn said, his locked-up mouth suddenly flashing into a wide grin before returning to its original state. The sight of Karn's teeth caught Garrett off guard, but he refocused his attention and asked for more clarification. Producing a book from his robe, Karn thumbed through it to a page near the back and then turned it around so Garrett could see. "For example, I understand that you have just completed a ruler's war. Successfully, in fact. Once again, my congratulations. If, during that time, you happen to have run across any artifacts that you don't feel will be useful to you, I am happy to take them off your hands for an appropriate price." Garrett's eyes narrowed as he stared at the pages revealed in the book while Karn spoke. Pictured there were 2 items, an obsidian casket and a long staff with what appeared to be a bone hand on the end. These were 2 of the artifacts that Garrett had looted from the first tomb after killing Agmayoth, and while he couldn't currently control them, he didn't fancy giving them up to a stranger either. "Those items are not for sale," Garrett said. "Out of idle curiosity though, if I were to trade them, would I suddenly find them in the hands of my enemies?" Karn didn't answer immediately, clearly weighing his words with what he understood of Garrett before he replied. "Though it's unlikely that a thing like this would happen, I can't say it never has. I would be lying if I claimed that I have never played 2 sides of the same conflict in order to maximize profit. After all, I am a merchant. Of course, if you wanted to ensure that something of that nature wouldn't happen, you could always add it to the conditions of sale. Just recognize that everything has a cost and will be factored into the final price I am willing to offer." Regarding Karn with a dispassionate gaze, Garrett suddenly smiled and pointed the rolled-up map at the merchant. "I assume that you have prepared something that you think will tempt me, and I'm curious what it is. Let's see how well you did your research." Karn's white smile appeared again and he spread out his arms, bowing to Garrett, who felt a fluctuation of mental energy as 3 items appeared floating in the air in front of him. Each was surrounded by a faint energy that pulsed slightly as Garrett focused on them. The 3 items appeared to be a chipped dagger made from a claw the length of Garrett's forearm, a twig, and a bead that flashed with faces that revealed all sorts of emotions. "You are correct, Your Majesty. I've brought 3 items for you today, each that I believe will help you solve a problem you face. The first is the Bead of Souls, an artifact of unimaginable history said to have belonged to the god of death himself. This bead carries a countless number of souls harvested throughout the ages and can be used to feed to any artifact that requires souls to activate. This was an item that Agmayoth desperately wanted, but alas, I arrived too late to sell it to him. His loss, however, is your gain. With the Bead of Souls in your possession, you'll be able to satiate the dreadful appetite of Lasric's tools." The entire time he spoke, Karn examined Garrett's face for any sign he was tempted, but Garrett was wearing a mask, and nothing could be seen from it. "The second item," Karn continued smoothly, "is a twig of unknown origin. It contains an endless vitality and its effect is simple. If you feed it to any plant, they will experience explosive growth that will change its very nature, allowing it to pass that same vitality on to its offspring." He paused, but still Garrett didn't move, so he could only continue. "And finally, the most important item in my offering today, the Primordial's Dagger." When Karn stopped his explanation after stating the name, Garrett finally looked interested, leaning forward to examine it more closely. Chapter 10. The soft mist curled around Pax's boot as she took a heavy step forward. Her shield shifted in front of her body as she began to scan the street. Behind her, Marin held his crossbow tight, his eyes darting from side to side as he tried to cover her. Kinsley hovered behind Marin, occasionally poking his head out as he nursed a faint flame between his hands. Asher and Estel followed steadily behind, content to leave the fighting to the other 3. They had been at this long enough that they had established a steady rhythm for clearing new territory. The further south from the inn they got, the nearer the territory became. They had already cleared some of the streets south of the inn, but predominantly had focused north, towards the crypts. Now, at Garrett's direction, they were moving toward the wide river that ran through the middle of the city. The truth was, they had no idea whether or not the river was actually there. As they continued their way south, things began to grow strange. In the waking world, the river had claimed much of the city south of the inn, with only a scant few streets between the inn's location and the edge of the water. In the dream, however, they had been walking for blocks, and there was no sign of the river, unless, of course, you counted the puddles that had begun to spring up all over the cobblestone streets. A faint fishy smell hung in the air, and the mist had changed as well. Normally, the parts of the dream they had yet to explore were covered by thick fog, but as they walked forward, the fog seemed to grow wetter and wetter, until the very act of moving through it left rivulets running down Pax's shield. Hearing a sound, Marin called for them to stop. He closed his eyes as he sensed for the enemy. The sound he had heard reminded him of a wet cough, the sort of sound someone with pneumonia might make. It was followed by a faint squelching that appeared on both their right and their left, and a moment before the hulking monsters stepped out of the alleyways, Marin gave Pax a heads up. One on the left, two on the right, 15 feet ahead. Even though she couldn't see them through the fog, Pax nodded, locking onto those two places as she shifted her shield into position, and lifted her mace to ready a strike. "Kinsley," Pax barked, as the looming figures began to reveal themselves. "My pleasure," Kinsley said, as the tongue of flame between his hands grew to the sides of his head. The heat scorched his clothing in his hands, but he didn't care one bit, and with a wild grin he threw the fireball into the mist, causing the air to splutter as the heavy moisture was boiled away under the heat of the flame. As the mist peeled back, it revealed their targets, two 7-foot-tall fishmen with wide webbed feet and long webbed fingers that ended in sharp claws. Though humanoid, the monsters walked with a stoop, and on their shoulders were fish heads with wide, gaping mouths and whiskers poking off to either side. Their eyes were massive, glowing like lanterns in the darkness, and sharp teeth protruded over their rubbery lips. Apart from the scales that covered their bodies, they also had a row of spines that stuck out from their backs, shoulders, and elbows. As soon as the team saw them, the fireball hit, exploding into a sheet of flame that completely swallowed one of the fishmen. A gargling scream that sounded like it had emanated from underwater resounded as the fishmen who had been devoured by the flame fell to the ground, writhing in pain. The other two fishmen, clearly furious, lifted their hands and rushed forward. Marin targeted the one on the left, sending a bolt with a glowing tip into its leg. He targeted its knee, and as soon as the bolt hit, the light covering it flashed, and the monster's knee was torn apart, causing it to collapse to the ground. The other fishman was met by Pax, whose mace lashed out with a surprising amount of speed. Though the fishman tried to block, Pax's mace crushed straight through its defenses, smashing its arms and landing on its sternum, with no visible reduction in force. The blow was so hard that rather than fly back, the fishman was simply crushed in place, its bones shattering as the air was forced out of its lungs in a startled squeak. Pax followed this up by turning and using her shield to slam the creature in the face, sending it tumbling backward, where it lay still, not moving. Using the counter-force of her blow to spin around, she jumped, crossing the distance between where she stood and the downed fishman who was now missing the bottom half of one of his legs. Pax's mace smashed down on the monster's head, silencing its cries. Soon the only sound was the crackle of the flame Kinsey had launched. Her face impassive, Pax knocked the side of her mace against her shield, clearing some of the green blood that decorated it. "This is the fourth group of fishmen we've run into," Marin remarked, crouching down next to one of them. "And they keep getting bigger, too." "What I want to know is where is this stupid river?" Pax asked, glaring into the thick fog. "We may not find a river at all," Asher said as he and Estelle walked up. Looking slightly queasy at the sight of the dead monsters, Estelle held her nose, not wanting to breathe in the foul smoke the charred corpse was letting off. "Can't we move on?" she asked, "and maybe have this conversation not surrounded by bodies?" "Sure," Pax said, kicking one of the corpses to the side of the road. By the time they came back through here, these monsters would be gone, their corpses either devoured by other denizens of the dream or absorbed back into the fog. For 2 more hours, they continued to search, trying to find the river, with no luck. Eventually, however, they did come across a familiar landmark, a large gate set in a tall wall with spikes on top. Peeking through the raw iron gate, they saw the faint outline of a massive building. "Whoa, that looks spooky," Kinsley said, his eyes gleaming. "What is that?" "That's Janus Manor," Kinsley said. "It is? How do you know that?" Pax asked. Without even looking at her, Asher pointed at the small placard set on the wall. It was cracked, and there were vines growing along it, but it clearly said Janus Manor. "Oh, that makes sense, but I thought Janus Manor was in the middle of the river, on an island." "It's likely that we're looking at a version of the city before the river flooded," Asher said. "All of these streets are now probably underwater." "Do you think it's why they're so wet?" Estelle asked, referencing the puddles that had grown increasingly large the further south they had gotten. "I do, and it's probably why there are fishmen everywhere, too." "That makes sense," Marin said, "though that would mean that this version of the city is old, really old. After all, the river has been flooded for close to 200 years now. We should report this. We came prepared to find the river, but instead we've got a lot more territory to clear first. I think we should pick up some other teams to help us." As the leader of the group, Pax considered the suggestion, and then, after making sure everybody else was okay with it, nodded. "Let's go. We'll return to Dreamer's Rest, and then tomorrow we can recruit a few more teams. I'm sure there will be someone interested in these new drops." As she spoke, she lifted her wrist, showing off a gold bracelet that had fallen from one of the fishmen. The design was old, and the gold was covered in a dull haze, as if it had been sitting underwater for a long time. Just as they started to turn around, however, Marin suddenly stopped them. "Hold on, do you hear that?" he asked. His senses were abnormally sharp, and when they noticed his expression beginning to change, everybody remained quiet, their ears straining. It started as a faint swish, and then transformed into the sound of rushing water. "Oh no," Marin yelled, and then without a word, began to run back towards Janus Manor. "There's water coming. We've got to get up high." The others didn't question, having learned to trust Marin's instincts when wandering around in the dream, and they sprinted after him. When he arrived at the gate, he tried to open it, only to find that it was rusted shut. He heard pounding footsteps behind him as Pax yelled, "Move!" As Marin dove to the side, Pax's shield hit the gate, and the entire thing bent inwards, with a tremendous screech. The team scrambled up and over the bent gate, rushing into the manor's grounds, as they headed for the high ground. The manor was built on a hill, sitting a good 50 feet above the surrounding area. As they drew closer, Asher's expression darkened, and he seemed to withdraw further into his robe. "Don't go inside," he said. "This place is cursed." Swearing under her breath, Pax, who had been about to rush up the stairs to the manor's door, stopped. "What do you mean?" she asked, her eyes never leaving the large manor in front of her. "There's a big bad in there," Asher said quietly. "My friends are terrified." Asher's friends, as he called them, were really a collection of nightmares that he had gathered from the dream and bound into his flesh. Even though they had yet to enter the manor itself, he could feel them trembling in fear, and knew that whatever existed inside the manor was something he wanted no part of. Before Pax could ask any other questions, the rushing sound of water rose around them, and they saw a wave approaching the hill. It crushed through the buildings below, smashing them into pieces, as it tore apart wood and stone alike with complete ease. When it slammed into the side of the hill, water sprayed high into the air, rising higher and higher, until it seemed as if it would lap at their feet. The water was dark, pitch black in fact, and everywhere it went, it appeared to erase everything it touched. It took almost 20 minutes before the raging water began to calm down, but when it did, it grew abnormally still, appearing almost glassy. The change was disquieting, and at a loss, the team exchanged glances. None of them were foolish enough to try touching the inky black water, but it seemed that going inside the manor wasn't an option either, if Asher's nightmares were to be believed. They were just trying to decide what to do, when Estelle suddenly pointed into the distance. Looking over, they saw a boat floating along on the river, a tattered sail hanging lifelessly from a rough mast erected in the center of it. The boat exuded a sense of time, appearing ancient, as if the wood would fall apart at the slightest touch. Half of a figurehead remained on the front, its head splintered, as if struck by a great blow. 6 long oars extended from it, vanishing down into the depths of the glassy river, leaving 6 thin trails of ripples that rapidly vanished as it floated forward. It was an incredibly creepy sight, and as they got closer, the awakened dreamers could feel a faint sound beginning to emerge in their souls. They knew that the sounds didn't exist, and yet, they could hear the snap of rope pulled taut in the wind, the sound of feet on the deck, and the shouts of the crew and the captain. Suddenly, those sounds ceased, as if every one of the sailors had stopped and turned to look at them. An intense feeling of danger shrouded Estelle, and she let out a shout. Brilliant white light flooding from her soul sparked to fill the air around the team, helping to block out some of the pressure from the ship, which continued to sail on its way down the river. After what seemed like forever, it finally passed the manor, eventually disappearing into the fog. Once it was out of sight, the pressure vanished, and Estelle collapsed into a sitting position, her breath ragged as she gulped down air. "Estelle, are you okay?" Pax asked. "Yes," came the breathless response. "I think I'm fine." "What was that?" Kinsley asked, his eyes shining like torches in the darkness. "Bad news," was Marin's curt reply. Just then, the water that had so suddenly rushed upon them began to recede, pulling back from the manor as if it was being dragged. To the team's astonished gazes, the water washed away, sucked toward the south, as if chasing the ship that had disappeared in the direction. As it rushed away, the buildings that had been obliterated by its flow were rapidly restored until everything looked as it had before they had begun to run. The only thing different was that the gate was still smashed down. "I think we better go," Pax said, a sentiment that everybody else on the team heartily agreed with. Without another word, they left the hill as fast as possible, not once looking behind them. To no one's surprise, but everyone's annoyance, the streets were positively filled with fishmen, seemingly deposited there by the fast-flowing water. After carving a bloody path through them, the team was finally able to relax when they saw the lights of the inn in the distance. "What do we tell the boss?" Kinsley asked. "I mean, we found the river, sort of." "We tell him exactly what we saw," Pax grunted. "And I mean exactly. If he wants to mess with it, he can. But as far as I'm concerned, that territory is too dangerous for the likes of us." After considering it, every single one of them had to agree with Pax's estimation. The situation had been fraught with danger, and though they had come through unscathed, it had been because of luck as much as caution. Had they not had the hill nearby, they very likely would have gotten caught up in that terrifying black water before being dragged out of the city into the swamp. And though they strongly suspected that the water had only come because the boat had passed by, they had no way of knowing when it would pass by again, meaning that every trip into the area south of the inn would be incredibly dangerous. When they finally entered the inn, they saw Garrett standing at the bar, chatting with an odd-looking man, whose crimson eyes swept over them with a strange, unblinking gaze. "This is Karn," Garrett said by way of introduction, "a traveling merchant. He's going to set up here for the next few days, and has goods to offer, if you have things to trade." After greeting the team, Karn took his drink and retired to a nearby table, where he began to pull out a few odds and ends. Noticing the pale expressions on everyone's faces, Garrett invited the others to sit down, and ordered them a round of drinks on the house. Tobe continued,